The Epistles of Paul. You were probably wondering when we were finally going to get to the New Testament, and we are finally there. I know there's a lot of ground to cover to try to help you to understand the world from which these texts come from, which I obviously feel is very, very important. But now we're actually going to get into the texts themselves, and we're going to start with Paul. He writes some of the earliest texts that we have in the New Testament, the most ancient documents relating to Christianity. Paul wrote about half of the New Testament. And the interesting thing there is that Paul never met the earthly Jesus. All of his theology, all of his understanding of Jesus came from these visions that he had while he was wandering around Arabia and then while he was in Damascus. So as you can imagine, there is a little bit of controversy about Paul because of that. There are some scholars who wonder if Paul moved Christianity away from the original vision of Jesus. Others would even go so far as to say that Paul invented Christianity. He's beloved, though, by the church, and his letters, I think, have been significant in shaping Christian theology. Now, here's another thing about that. Paul writes a lot about who Jesus is, or what we would say Christology. He writes very little about stuff that Jesus did, or even stuff that Jesus taught. Now, he might allude to some of the teachings of Jesus, but he never quotes Jesus, and or rarely quotes Jesus, I should say, and rarely speaks about any of the events, miracles, things that Jesus did, things that happened to Jesus. So the vast majority, I should say, of his letters are actually dealing with ethical issues that are going on in the church, or Christological issues, talking about who Jesus is, and in particular the risen Christ. So a lot of ground to cover, so let's begin. One of the first things that we need to understand in studying the letters of Paul is that they were just that. They were letters. Paul was sitting down to write to somebody or a church, a group of people, and he had no idea at the time that his letters would be scrutinized some 2,000 years later. In fact, if we could magically transport Paul to today and reveal to him that his letters are placed on the same level of authority as the Torah, he would be shocked and horrified at that notion, because he had something on his mind that he was trying to convey to a group of people that he was writing his letters to, and that was simply the main motivation for this. Now, when Paul sat down to write his letters, what did he do? Well, the first thing he had to do is pick something to write on. And back in the first century, people wrote on just about anything they could get their hands on: wax tablets, clay tablets, even pottery shards. Now, most letters, in fact, Paul certainly chose for his medium something called papyrus. Now, if you look at the picture on the screen, you can see papyrus, and look how fragile it is. And if you look carefully at the edges, you can probably even see some of the fibers, plant fibers, that were used to make this paper. It did not last very long, and if you wanted anything to last, what you wound up having to do is to make copies of these letters, and that certainly would have been the case for Paul's letters. So first thing that we need to realize is that the material is very, very fragile. But then we also have to remember that most people in the first century were illiterate, and so many of them used a secretary called an amanuensis to actually write the letter. And even those who were literate, most of the time, would employ an amanuensis to write the letter. Paul did this, we know, because every now and then he'll mention the name of the amanuensis in the letter that he is writing. For example, Tertius was his amanuensis for his letter to the Romans. And this was a very common practice. Now, it's unknown how much freedom that Paul gave to his amanuensis. Often in Roman culture, these secretaries were given quite a bit of freedom, and sometimes they were even just given a theme to write on, and then the amanuensis himself would have crafted the letter and the author then would have signed off on the letter. Now, given the very specific things that Paul talks about and the depths of his argument, sometimes it's quite clear that Paul was very involved in what was actually written down. But it's not out of the question, I would say, for the amanuenses to paraphrase Paul from time to time. So we need to understand that what we have as the letters of Paul probably were not a word-for-word dictation from Paul himself. They were through the filter of the amanuensis who was writing the letter down. Now, another thing that we need to understand about these letters is that a deliverer was needed. No postal service existed back then, so Paul needed to rely on help, and often the deliverer was expected to make sure that the letter was read before the congregation, and perhaps the deliverer, him or herself, would read the letter to the congregation. And perhaps, and most probable, they would even be required to have sort of a Q&A session while the congregation or the leaders asked the deliverer to clarify content in the letter. Paul often used very trusted people to do this. In fact, Phoebe was one of his trusted deliverers. She was a deaconess in the first century, and she was tasked with carrying Paul's most important letter, his letter to the Romans. Now, another element in letter writing was the use of scribes. Scribes would have been sort of the Xerox copiers of their day. They would have been the ones tasked with copying and recopying the letters. And some of these letters actually were intended for several congregations, and so scribes would have been employed to do something like that. And again, many scribes took great freedom sometimes in their recopying of letters. They would have perhaps corrected grammar or even have changed words from time to time. There are instances of many of the early church fathers complaining about some of the things that some of the changes that the scribes would make that they felt weren't true to the original statements that they had made or that were written down. So scribes, it's important for us to understand, were another very important part of letter writing in the first century. Now, a final thing that is very important for us to remember is that we have no original manuscripts of these letters. In other words, the first letter written either by Paul or an amanuensis does not exist. What we have are copies of copies of copies of copies. And so when you hear people talk about original manuscripts, you need to realize that the earliest manuscripts that we have are dated centuries, sometimes after these things were actually written. And as we get closer to the first century, all we have really are fragments for about 100 years or so after these letters or texts were written. So no original manuscripts exist. And indeed, for some of these things, there may not even have been an original manuscript. What I mean by that is if Paul intended for several letters to go out to different congregations, it may very well be that the first draft of all of these things would have been different to each congregation. So it may very well be possible for some of the more open letters that there really wasn't a original manuscript, but a collection of manuscripts that were then sent out to various congregations. Form. So, one of the other things that's important for us to remember about these letters is that because they were such a big deal in Greco-Roman world, that there were actually textbooks written about form and the kind of form that a letter should have depending upon its purpose. And there were many purposes for letters. Sometimes they may have just been a friendly howdy. Other times, congratulations, or maybe there was an inquiry, or a thank you note, or a note of encouragement. There were dozens of different purposes for letters, and for each purpose there was a certain form that would have been expected to that the writer use. Now, there's some debate about the forms that we find in the letters of the New Testament as to whether or not they were formal or informal, meant for the public or meant for private. Truth of the matter is, there is quite a lively discussion on this. Now, there is a general form that will be used for the New Testament epistles. Now, this is not to be understood in a strict way, but in general, the letters are going to follow a particular form. And there probably were a mixture of several purposes then intended for these letters. So most of the letters are going to start off with some kind of a salutation. Basically, this is what we do with our letters when we say, "Dear so-and-so." So it's kind of a howdy to a certain group of people or to a church. And then there would have been a greeting, and oftentimes the greeting would come from the author, or in some respects, there were several authors to the letter that would be identified at the beginning of the letter, and perhaps even specific individuals in the congregation would have been singled out at this point as well. And then prayers. Sometimes the letter writer would start off with some kind of a blessing, word of blessing to the people who were to receive the letter. And then would have come the main bulk of the letter, which would be the body. This is where the author finally gets down to business and starts to write about what he intended the letter to be about all along. And then some, but not all, letters will have some kind of a greeting at the end of the letter from other people. In other words, Paul might say something like, Timothy says hi, or Silas says howdy to so-and-so. And so if Paul was staying with a group of people at that time, he might extend greetings from them. Pseudepigraphy. Now, the content I'm about to get into here can be troubling for some students. So let me just give you kind of a heads up that the issue of pseudepigraphy is a controversial issue, and there are many different opinions on it. And so I just want you to know, I want you to be aware of the controversy, and I certainly want you to be aware of the subject matter, because it's a very, very important subject when we study texts in the New Testament, and in particular, the letters. And what pseudepigraphy is all about is it asks the question, did the stated author of the letter actually write it? In other words, when we're talking about the letters of Paul, did the Apostle Paul actually write this letter? And this is an important academic question to ask. And like I said, some students feel uncomfortable asking this question because in their mind, they're saying, well, if it says Paul wrote the letter, then surely Paul wrote the letter. Well, it's a little bit more complicated than that, and I'm about to explain why here in a minute. But before I do, I want you to understand that this discussion in no way is meant to be an attack on the Bible or an attack on what you may have been told growing up in the church. And you certainly will never, ever, ever be evaluated in this church, in this class for what you believe about pseudepigraphy. I just want you to be aware of the critical issue because it does play an important role to the subject, and it's important that we understand that this issue exists. So let's get into it. There are several layers of authenticity when it comes to letter writing in the first century. And the scruples or the ethics that we might have today when it comes to letter writing was very, very different than it was in the first century. And so we need to, I think, first of all, understand that our approach to letter writing today is very different from the approach to letter writing back in the first century. So there are several layers or levels of authorship. The first level is literal authorship. All right, so this is essentially where the author actually, with his own hands or her own hands, wrote the letter. So it's coming directly from the author's brain. The next level would be dictation, and so I've already introduced to you the idea of an amanuensis, and so dictation would be a word for word writing of the letter, where the amanuensis or secretary was given absolutely no freedom whatsoever in what went down on paper. And then there is delegated authorship. And this is where the amanuensis would have been given some freedom, if not a great deal of freedom, in crafting the letter. Now, with this kind of authorship, it's important to understand that the author would have read the letter before it was sent off, and certainly would have signed off on what was there on what was put down on paper. But some of the crafts, some of the writing, some of the ideas in the letter would have come from the mind of the amanuensis in conjunction with the what the author told him to write down. And so this is delegated authorship. All right, then you have posthumous authorship. And this is where an author dies before the letter is completed. And so since the amanuensis or the student had a pretty good idea of where the letter was going and how it was going to be finished, the student or amanuensis would have then completed the letter, knowing the intention of the author, and then sent it off posthumously as if the teacher had written the entire thing. This was completely acceptable in the first century. There's nothing unethical about this. And so it happened from time to time. And so this was another level of authorship that would have been acceptable in the first century. And then you have something called apprentice authorship. And this is where a student or a school, because many of the major teachers, and this certainly would have been, and certainly the major figures of the New Testament would have been in this camp. So you have a major teacher who has a student or a collection of students, a school. Paul certainly had students, or even a school of students underneath him who he taught during his lifetime. And apprentice authorship then would have been this: a student or a school would continue to write letters in the name of the author after he died. And the idea here is that since they had the authority to speak in the name of the author while he was alive, for example, Phoebe, we talked about Phoebe being a deliverer for Paul. Phoebe or Timothy or some of these others who delivered letters for Paul would have been given the authority to speak on behalf of Paul at the place that they delivered the letter. And so one of the common practices back in the first century would have been for these people then, after Paul died, possibly, to have written letters in his name and signed off on them as if Paul had written them, because while he was alive, they had been given the authority to do that then. And so they would have felt justified, sometimes even obligated, to protect the legacy of their teacher after he died, and so would have written letters as if he had written the letters themselves, addressing current issues. Think of it this way: if Paul were alive today, this is what he would have said about this particular issue, because I am a student of Paul and I was a close associate of Paul, and I, of all people, would have known what he would have said on this particular issue. And then they would have signed off on it as if Paul had actually written the letter. And again, this was a common practice in the first century, and some scholars believe that some of the letters of Paul were written in this manner. And then we have honorable pseudepigraphy, and this is where admirers of a leader or a teacher would have written in his name afterwards as a way of paying tribute to him. Sort of like what we do today sometimes with a Festschrift. And then last thing is, I'm sorry, there's honorable pseudepigraphy. The last thing would have been forgery. Now, we have to acknowledge that forgeries existed in the first century, and where people weren't really writing with the best of intentions. Maybe they had an agenda that they were pushing, or a theology that they were trying to get some credibility behind. We certainly have many instances of forged documents in the first century, whereby a prominent New Testament character, the name is used long after they're dead, and the letter or other kind of pseudepigraphical work, like a gospel, would have been written as if that New Testament character had written it. And the whole agenda here is really to try to pretend to be that character in order to give your agenda or your theology credibility. And like I said, we have many examples of this that were written in 1st, 2nd, 3rd century. Pseudepigraphy in the New Testament then. So let's apply then what we've learned to the letters, the epistles in the New Testament. Now, Paul obviously wrote most of these letters, but we have other letters that were supposedly by other New Testament characters. For example, Jude and James and John. What about these letters? Well, just for starters, let me give you an overview of sort of the consensus of scholarship on these letters. To begin with, we'll talk about anonymous letters. Hebrews, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John are anonymous letters. These 4 letters do not have anywhere in the text an author mentioned. And so for these letters, for all of scholarship, authorship is up for debate. Now, there are traditions surrounding these letters. For example, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, the tradition is that John wrote these letters, which is why they're called 1st, 2nd, 3rd John. But the texts themselves actually do not identify the letter. And so I think just about all scholars are comfortable sort of leaving it up to debate as to who actually wrote these letters. Now, there are also some universally accepted letters. These are letters the vast majority of scholarship accept as being actually written by the stated author. These letters include Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, 1st Thessalonians, and Philemon. All of these are, for the most part, undisputed letters of Paul, and generally scholarship accepts the fact that Paul wrote these letters. We do have, however, disputed letters, and in particular when it comes to Paul, the disputed letters include Ephesians, Colossians, 2nd Thessalonians, 1st and 2nd Timothy, and Titus. Oftentimes you'll hear New Testament scholars refer to these letters as Deutero-Pauline letters. Essentially what that means is authorship is questioned. And so since it is questioned, these letters are many times sort of set apart as a result of that. Now, you have many scholars who will argue that Paul actually wrote these letters. But you also have many scholars who will argue that Paul didn't write these letters, and we'll get into some of the rationales here in a little bit. Now, these are not the only disputed letters. The letter of James, the letters of 1st and 2nd Peter, and the letter of Jude. All 4 of these letters are also questioned with respect to whether or not the stated author actually wrote these letters. Now, why is authorship questioned? Why can't we just take at face value that if the letter says, I, Paul, wrote this letter, that Paul wrote the letter? Why would New Testament scholars even approach this issue? Well, the reason is because as you read the disputed letters, there are some red flags that pop up for some of these scholars. And these scholars look at those red flags and it makes them go, well, it's odd that that's there. And a very simple solution to why that sentence or paragraph or a letter was written is that Paul didn't write that letter. So let's talk about some of those red flags that might pop up. Language and style. We all have a certain way that we write. And my guess is if you were to read a letter that came from your parent, and if you were to read a letter that came from one of your friends, without even looking at who signed the letter, you would be able to know, my parents didn't write that letter. Or if your parents are trying to play a joke on you, I know my friend didn't write that letter. That sounds something like my dad would write. Right? So, even on a most basic level, we can tell sometimes just from language and style where the letter came from. And there are some letters where scholars look at that and go, the vocabulary here, the style here, it just really doesn't sound like Paul. And so that's one of the red flags that might pop up. Theology is another issue. As I'm sure you well know, Paul had a very definite opinion on theology. For example, he was big on Jesus being the foundation for the church. And he makes it clear in some of his undisputed letters that he sometimes had little respect for the notion of apostolic authority. I read Galatians, for example. He mentions that in his letter to Galatians. And yet you got this disputed letter, Ephesians, where he praises the apostles as the foundation of the church and not Jesus as the foundation of the church. So that's one example of a little theological discrepancy that pops up that make scholars go, really? Paul would say that? After how emotional he is in Galatians about disputing apostolic authority. So it's these little things like this that can also pop up that make scholars question. And then you have historical anachronisms. What this means is that sometimes a letter will address something that happened after the author dies. To maybe put it in modern context, if you had a letter that was purported to have been written when the author was alive, and say the author died in 1995, all right? But then there's a reference in that letter to the trade towers being destroyed. That kind of thing would make you go, oh, wait a minute here. This person was dead for almost a decade before the trade towers were destroyed. How can there be a reference in this letter to that event? Sometimes there are these little historical anachronisms that can kind of pop up in a letter that make scholars go, that's odd. That person, that event hadn't happened yet. And there are several little other instances or illustrations as we get into the letters that I'll point out that illustrate this perhaps a little bit better. All right, now biographical material can sometimes be a red flag as well. What I mean by that is sometimes the letter can refer to something, an event in the author's life that we have no record of the author actually doing. An example of this can be found in 1 Timothy and Titus, where the author talks about visiting some towns on a missionary journey that Paul nowhere mentions anywhere else. So we have a pretty good idea from other material, these 3 missionary journeys of Paul. We know where he went, and yet 1 Timothy and Titus mention other cities that we have no record of Paul ever visiting. So that is a bit of a red flag for scholars as they try to figure out authorship. And then we also need to take into account the unreliability of tradition in the church. There are many traditions in the early church that we know are wrong. For example, there was a tradition for a long time that Paul wrote the letter to the Hebrews. Now, remember, Hebrews is anonymous, but there was a very, very early tradition that Hebrews was written by Paul. In fact, one of the reasons why the letter to the Hebrews makes it into the canon was because of this belief that Paul wrote that letter. You'd be hard-pressed to find a New Testament scholar today that would say Paul wrote the letter to the Hebrews. And so there's a lot of debate about, well, then who did write the letter to the Hebrews? So this is an example of a very early church tradition attached to a letter that, for the most part, I think has been debunked by modern scholars today. And so truth of the matter is, every now and then, these early traditions are wrong about a letter or even another New Testament text. And so I think it's just common sense that we question these traditions in order to find out the truth. Let's talk next then about pseudepigraphy and the challenge that it presents to faith. I realize that when we're asking the question, did Paul really write this letter, that some people can get very uncomfortable with that question. It's as if we're questioning the Bible, we're questioning its authority, and some might even view it as an attack against faith. And so the issue of pseudepigraphy is controversial. It's a controversial subject. And there are many good New Testament scholars who argue against it. And so I want you to know firsthand that there is no consensus among New Testament scholars on this particular issue. And for many very good New Testament scholars, they will defend the reliability of these early traditions surrounding the texts and the process by which the early church chose these letters, and the fact that they believe them to be the authentic letters, for example, of Paul. So I want you to know that many New Testament scholars out there defend Pauline authorship. And those who do often point to a chronology for Paul whereby he actually didn't have 3 journeys, but 4. What they will argue is that on his trip to Rome that's mentioned at the book of Acts, that he actually survives Rome at that time and went on a 4th journey to Spain. And by adding these years to the chronology of Paul, they say this would give him ample time to write some of these supposed pseudepigraphal letters. And so they come up with a new chronology for Paul whereby he lives late into the 60s. And that takes care of some of the mysterious biographical material that we find in 1 Timothy and Titus, for example, and is a solution that would allow for Paul to have actually written these letters. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, though, those who defend pseudepigraphy will say, well, we have no reliable early data on this that backs up a supposed 4th journey of Paul. And since we have no data, we have to, the best evidence that we have points to only 3 journeys of Paul, and Paul being executed in Rome somewhere around early to mid-60s. They are going to argue that those who try to defend Pauline authorship have come up with complicated schemes in order to protect an early tradition that ought to be questioned. So you have very good New Testament scholars on both sides of this issue. Now, I want to talk a little bit then about the extremes that unfortunately I think can sometimes happen with this issue. Some who insist on Pauline authorship will argue that to reject Paul as the author of a letter means that you are rejecting the authority of the letter or even rejecting the validity of the entire Bible. The fallacy of this argument is that we need to understand that the Bible is comprised of many authors, and they come from all walks of life. And even though the early church may have believed that Paul wrote this particular letter, they've got a lot of other things wrong, and they may have gotten this thing wrong. Apostolic authority was important, don't get me wrong, but even Paul believed that there were limits to apostolic authority, and that ultimately authority comes from Jesus. So, though the early church felt apostolic authority was crucial, the teachings of the gospel was that God could use anyone to convey his message, and oftentimes used people from all walks of life to convey his message. And so why does the letter have to come from the hand of an apostle for it to be authoritative? So that's something to think about. Now, on the other side of the coin, there are those who insist on pseudepigraphy, who argue that one is not being intellectually honest if one does not reject Pauline authorship. That's another extreme that I have a lot of problems with, because there is so much that we don't know about the first century. We're dealing with a small amount of reliable data when it comes to the era of the Jesus movement that we're talking about. And so if we're going to be really intellectually honest, we need to admit that there is very little that we can be absolutely certain about. And that includes pseudepigraphy. It's quite reasonable that Paul wrote all the letters that are attributed to him. And so to accuse those who hold that position of not being intellectually honest, I think, is untenable. Now, let me get to the bottom line here then. For the purpose of this class, remember, I'm approaching this class as a church historian, and so I'm using my craft and my discipline to understand these letters and these texts. And so that's going to be the data that I am going to prioritize for the purpose of this class. So as we look at the disputed letters of Paul, we're going to look at them as if they were written after his death. At the very least, I believe they represent material that will become important to the church later in the first century and the early part of the second century. And so that's the approach that we're going to take in this class as we look at New Testament material. Now, that being said, I know that many students feel it is important to retain Pauline authorship. And for those of you who feel that that's important, please hear me when I say that I do not want you to feel in any way pressured to embrace pseudepigraphy. If your presuppositions lead you to reject pseudepigraphy, that is absolutely going to be respected in this class. I only ask that you respect my approach and, walk along with me as we look at these critical questions and as I raise these critical questions. The only thing that you're going to be evaluated on in this class is your understanding of the critical questions, not your answers to these critical questions. So if you struggle or if this is really, really bothering you, please contact me. Let's sit down and talk through this, because the last thing I want is for you to feel uncomfortable in this class. I want this class to be a very safe place for everyone. So for those who are comfortable with pseudepigraphy, I want them to be comfortable in this class. And for those who hold to Pauline authorship, I want you to be comfortable in this class. Let's have a wonderful, engaging dialogue about this and learn from each other.